I'm hitting the big red button now. Okay, welcome everybody to episode 6 of Fair Go, the Australian Basic Income podcast, discussion group rather. We're joined for this edition by Ben Spies-Butcher of Macquarie University. We're from Basic Income Australia. What we're always campaigning for is a completely universal, not means tested, not targeted, above poverty line basic income, so that no one in Australia really has to worry about the necessities of life. Now, I understand that, Ben, that's basically a goal you support, but what you put out a proposal in October of last year, which was more of a sort of something between where we are now and that longer term goal. Is that a correct framing? And can you just take us through the proposal a little bit?
Yeah, thanks very much for having me on the chat, and hello to a few friendly faces I can see there as well. So lovely to see everyone here. So I think in one sense, you might say it's a bit of a stepping stone to what you just described, but I think that's mainly in terms of its level. And so we'll come back to that. We put this together pre-pandemic. In a world where thinking that New Start might rise by $75 a week sounded like a ridiculously optimistic scenario. So I completely accept that doesn't get you to the poverty line, and we need to do something that really does. So in that sense, yes. I think in the other sense, and I'll just run through what it is in a second. Part of our approach is questioning what we mean by means testing and what we mean by universalism and its relationship. And in that sense, I don't think we would necessarily say our proposal is a stepping stone. It really is the end result. So just to give you the basics, our proposal is essentially for New Start plus $75 a week, which is about $18,500 a year. That would go to every adult of working age. So the proposal isn't about people who are of pension age, and it's for people 18 and over. It's individualised, so everyone gets it. And it is not conditional on any activity, doing anything, filling in any forms beyond that. But it is means tested. It's means tested in a very light way, which means that people receive some of the payment all the way up to $180,000 a year. They don't receive any payment above $180,000 a year. And the way the means test works, we said, look, there is no real difference between us giving everyone a universal payment and then taxing them 40 cents in the dollar, or giving everyone a payment and means testing at 40 cents in the dollar. That those two things are effectively identical. Yeah, they have the same impact on your income, on the incentives you face. They have the same impact on the budget costings and bottom line. So there are some versions of basic income which often called a negative income tax, which take that approach to its logical conclusion, which is to say that when you start earning income, you lose a payment through a means test up until the point that you have no payment left, at which case you start paying tax at usually exactly the same rate as the means test. That doesn't have to be the case, but most proposals say that. And that means that there are no people who receive a payment who pay income tax, and no people who pay income tax who receive a payment. Now, our proposal is not that. It's kind of halfway between that negative income tax and a universal payment funded through the tax system, if that makes sense. So it has a more gentle means test that is deliberately designed to integrate into the existing tax system on a principle that the amount you lose per dollar should increase as your income increases. So people with lower incomes should lose less money per dollar they earn, and people on very high incomes should lose more income per dollar they earn. Yeah, that's a principle of the progressive tax system. That's not the case at the moment, as anyone who's on a payment probably knows. As you start earning income, you lose your benefit at a much higher rate. than the lowest marginal tax rate. So it smooths that out. And I think, so we looked at where that leaves you in terms of inequality and poverty and the budget's bottom line. And we can talk about that. I imagine you probably want to talk about that a little bit. But I think it also, for us, it outlined some practical measures that you could incrementally move in that direction. And they are to get rid of the other conditions that aren't means testing from New Start, or whatever the basic payment is, Job Seeker now, that you should individualise payments so that they're not dependent on what somebody else does, only on what you do. And that you, instead of giving tax cuts to people, particularly on higher incomes, we reduce the means test for people on lower incomes. And that should be the basis of governments wanting to give back bracket creep, stimulate demand, whatever. That is much more redistributive, much fairer, I think, and actually has better incentive effects too, better kind of macroeconomic competition effects, to the extent you're interested in that. So I don't know if that's useful as a overview, but effectively it's $18,500 a year. Everyone gets it who's of working age. It's completely individualized. There is no work test, activity test of any sort. And you gradually lose it, like you do paying income tax, until eventually there's none of it left when you're earning quite a lot of money.
Okay, that's a great intro. Look, I'm going to abuse my position of chair and get first question, then we'll throw it open. I can see people laughing because I always do that. But we'll get questions. If people have a question, please raise your hand, and I'll come around to you in the order that the hands are raised. There's a button in your Zoom chat for doing that. If you can't figure out how to do it, Google it in another tab. Anyhow, I hear what you're saying, and it sounds like this is a proposal that was authored, as you say, in the before times, before we've seen this sort of radical expansion of government spending and welfare payments. But what you propose still does end up being more generous than where we're about to land with we're now going to be a $50 increase. So you were suggesting, over a year ago or so when this was being written, $25 more than that in increase per week.
No, so $100 more than that. So that's
okay,
you get
great.
$50 a fortnight, but we were going to give them $75 a week.
Okay, fantastic, right? So that we're talking about it. We're talking about a weekly payment that's creeping up towards the Henderson poverty line, if not over it. It would definitely be above the relative poverty line in Australia, I believe, that payment. Anyhow, the one thing I would push back on, I mean, obviously we would, say as high as we can go without causing, all kinds of problems is good. And we'd want to, look at how you can adjust other policies to make that possible, to make sure the floor is as high as possible. But let's leave that to the side. The one thing I would push back on is you're saying that it's the same to what we would suggest, and what a lot of universal basic income advocates say is you pay everybody the same flat rate, and then you get it back in tax from higher income earners. So if you're worried that it's too sweet a deal for people on high incomes, you do that at during the tax collection phase is how you do that. And you're saying, well, means testing is just the same. I would say in a perfect world, yes, but the difference is what we live in an imperfect world where administrative errors are part of life, and you always have glitches. And as someone who's been on welfare, I've experienced all kinds of weird glitches that can do with paperwork and immigration status and all kinds of stuff. The difference is that if it's taxed back rather than means tested at the beginning, when there's an error, the error is that the government misses out on a little bit of tax revenue, which they can then chase, and they're big enough to take the hit. Whereas if there's an error on the other side and you're incorrectly deemed as being incorrectly excluded from it, a small household that's on a low income can't take that hit. Has that something that's been raised with you since you published the paper? Has that come up at all?
No, look, it's a great question, and no, it hasn't. So thanks for raising it. Look, I think part of this was based on the logic of the family tax benefit. And I don't know if anyone's been following the US stimulus debate, but effectively Biden's just introduced something like this for families with children, which is about to halve child poverty overnight. So it's kind of a basic, that if you accept what we're doing as basic income, it's a basic income for kids that's about to be introduced over there. So you're absolutely right. There are errors, and the error can leave someone worse off. Now, the alternative of that weekly amount is how they're reconciled at the end of the year. And this happened with that family payment in Australia, where there were consistently overpayments to people. That is, when people update their payment details, it turns out they earned a little bit more money and they weren't eligible for quite as much family payment as they had actually got, and led to a whole range of quite large bills for people. So people would get like a $1,500, $2,000 bill at the end of the year to pay back their family benefit, or to effectively pay extra tax. Yeah. And that payment had this same logic, that it was partly integrated into the tax system. I think there are two really interesting things about what the real world experiment of what happened there. So the first is that people who receive family payments just don't have the same experience of the welfare system that people on other payments have. It's to some extent also true of age pensioners. But particularly family payment, because it's integrated into the tax system, people are treated much more like taxpayers. And that part of the point of this is to try and transition whatever payment happens into the tax system, so that those two things are seen as the same, and we integrate their bureaucracies.
That's
but the other
was, there's something I've always wondered is why you get asked what your income is when you're applying to Centrelink, and then they check with the tax office. And if you've said one thing and the tax office says another, you get in trouble. It's like, why don't you just check with the tax office to start with? Or as you're suggesting, I believe, why doesn't the tax office just administer the whole thing?
Yeah, completely. And effectively gives you a credit if you're below a certain amount, right? Rather than taking it out, it gives you a credit. But what happened when people did have these large bills at the end of the year? Because there were so many of them, and this is a really big deal, the Howard government, a coalition government, very conservative, decided to introduce a new bonus payment that happened just after the end of the financial year. And that was essentially so that, you got your bill, but you also got this bonus payment that reconciled them. And one of the things that the lesson that I had from that was, if you get enough people to get this payment, their problems become government problems, and they get solved. And even conservative governments will solve the problems of large numbers of people who are swing voters. So that's a large part of the logic of it actually comes from that, essentially. Right. And I agree that that's not necessarily completely ideal, but in terms of the kind of practical politics, you can see a trajectory to how to get here. And I think the good thing about this is that once you start on that trajectory, so once you start easing the means tests, more people start receiving the payment, the politics of the issue becomes self-reinforcing, and more people start demanding things from it. Becomes more useful for governments to give them things. And as they give them more money, if you raise the payment with the same taper rate, suddenly more people start becoming eligible. So I think it's that kind of internal dynamic that we thought would be self-reinforcing and provide a political pathway to actually get this done.
So rather than stepping stones, it's a smooth glide. On that note, we'll go to Michael, who's got a question. Michael, go ahead.
Yeah, am I unmuted? Yeah, I am. Ben, great discussion. Thank you. First question is, can I get my hands on a copy of your paper? Is that possible, or is that you have to be part of an education institution to get it?
No, look, at the moment, Sage, because we got an article in the Sydney Morning Herald when this came out, and which led to a bit of media, broader interest. And so Sage, the publisher, agreed to make it open access for a period of time, but it seems like it still is. I looked the other day and it still was. So if you have any problems, email me and I will send you a copy, which I'm very happy to do.
All right. And Ben's, sorry, Austin, you've got Ben's email, or we've got that somewhere?
Yeah, we can hook you up. Don't worry.
All right. Okay. I did have another question, but I've forgotten it, so I'll let somebody else have a talk.
Stephen.
Yeah, is there much talk about universal basic income in universities, like amongst academics? Is it kind of a hot topic or not?
In terms of academic research, do you mean?
Yeah, like
or
just
is it
in university, like have you got a sense that it's...
Yeah, so I've been working with a few people, and I think Josh has been part of some of those discussions too, that have been, there's been a substantial increase in interest, I'd say over the last few years, but particularly during COVID. So there are a number of people who have been working on similar things, and there's been a few kind of alternatives and books put out with different positions. I think you guys have already had people from the livable income guarantee proposal, which was a number of academics who got together to do that as well. John Quiggin kind of headed it up, who's an economist up at UQ. And I know there's also a bit of research happening at the moment, and Elise Klein, I think, is releasing a report next week with a number of other people about the experiences of people during COVID with the COVID supplement payment, where I think for, in terms of the sort of reforms that we're talking about, the COVID supplement actually acts as a bit of a trial. So it's a more adequate payment. It's effectively unconditional, but it is means tested, but it's generously means tested. So there's a generous partner test and a generous actual means test, given the circumstances of COVID. So I think it gives you a reasonable idea of what the sorts of things that are likely to happen. And so they've been doing some research on that, and that certainly there's some quite strong evidence already that it has helped people be healthy. That is, to be able to access the sorts of things they need to, like fresh food, being able to pay for their medicine, that kind of stuff, as well as emotional and mental health. And there's even some evidence that it has potentially increased people's genuine job search activity. That is, it put people in a position where they could think about what kind of job they actually wanted and take realistic steps to try and get themselves ready for that sort of employment. So there's a lot of academic interest, I think, that's now being sparked in the last little while. And I imagine that we're going to have quite a bit of research over the next few years that is examining what happened under COVID and thinking about the implications for policymakers in the future.
And just quickly, is it seen as a big transformational change, or is it just a reform of the welfare state? Are you getting a sense that this is the big idea, or?
Look, I think it depends who you ask, right? So, so certainly some people see it as a potential step towards, kind of phasing out capitalism, and the wage labour relationship, by allowing people to live outside of, work, or radically, downscaling work, allowing people to do all sorts of useful things with their lives that aren't involved in getting paid for it. And certainly I know there's some philosophy work that looks at that as a radical transformation of social relations. And certainly what we've been presenting sounds, I've presented this as a reform to the welfare state, right? A reform to the payment system that would sit alongside still needing universal healthcare and reforms to make education free and to ensure equitable access to housing and other things like that. I suppose for me, one of the most interesting things about basic income was that there'd been a debate about raising Newstart for 10 years. There'd been series of debates about how we could, get rid of poverty traps, make the Centrelink thing more humane.
It's just going to keep going on and on. Don't worry.
So all of that had been happening. And look, I turned up to a lot of the public forums that were trying to build a case for that. And look, if you got 12 people rock up, you were feeling pretty good. And then I went and got involved in a couple of basic income talks, and there were 300 people in the room. The average age was 25. And it seemed that might be a better way of actually mobilizing real politics to try and do something. And so I suppose the approach I've been having, and that Troy and Elise, who we wrote this with, is partly going, how do you mobilize real politics, which has to be transformational? It has to be about a big picture, different way of living. And how do you combine that with the sorts of things that you might actually get done that are meaningful and will actually result in real changes? And I suppose we're suggesting that this is a way to go about that sort of a politics, which tries to combine, I suppose, technical policy changes with a big picture story. Matter for you whether you think that's convincing or not.
Yeah. So Ben, one of the things that really strikes
I think
me.
Josh was next.
Was he?
Josh was next, Michael. But I
Okay,
mean,
sorry.
Josh, do you mind if Michael finishes up, or do you really want to get your question in?
You go.
Josh is definitely next, guys.
Okay. Well, what we've got basically is a tension at the moment between supporting the poor and motivating workers, and that really came out to me in an article that Bob Gottliebson wrote in the Australian, where he was quoting the fact that, you know, cafes and service stations and pizza operators and tradespeople or operating companies can't get employees because they're competing with JobSeeker and JobKeeper. And so on the one hand, you've got this whole motivating, getting people to work problem versus the payment of the welfare. But it seems to me that the basic income dispenses with that problem, because anybody who's got the basic income is then, if they want to improve themselves, can go off and do it and take that available work without having to have the payment compete with their wage. And so is that something that you're finding is a positive, Ben, in your discussions, or is it?
Yeah, so certainly our proposal tries to address the substantive issue that you raise, which I think is actually slightly different from the conservative critique, and which is a bit of a problem that we can think through. Right. So one is what economists would call an incentive effect. That is that there's a disincentive because you lose the benefit when you work. Now, we completely address that. And as I was saying, that difference between effective marginal tax rates is what that's called. There's between benefit withdrawal and the tax rate being seen as the same thing. What we're effectively saying is we should let people keep more of their benefits for longer as they work. And that gets rid of the real incentive problem. And just by doing that, you end up with most people getting the payment, right? Because if you don't take it away very quickly, you end up with some of it for a very long time. That's one way of universalizing things. But I think the conservative critique is actually different from that. It's that people will not work in this job if they have any alternative at all that doesn't see them starving. And that's actually what they're arguing. That is, if there's any alternative at all that leaves someone to be able to not die and avoid doing the job, then they'll avoid doing the job. And I mean, I think that is the real opposition. And I think we do need to call it out for that. That's what they're actually arguing. And suggest that that's just completely, like, it's not only inhumane, like it's a horrific view of what life should be like, right?
Quick plug for our next, in 2 weeks' time, we're getting Carl Wiederquist on, who's a US philosopher, I'm not sure, and he's very much focused on, that's his line, very much, that we actually live in a, this isn't a matter of a free market, it's a market of compelled labor, where any means of sustenance outside of servitude to some major corporation is denied, right? And that this is, with the Enclosures Act, and he puts it in this historical sweep of how we were sort of pushed to become a standing labor force for the masters of industry. But we'll go to Josh, and that's in 2 weeks' time. Everyone, watch out for it on Basic Income.
Looking forward to it. I have a bit of a meta question, which is, you mentioned you designed this before the pandemic. Could you talk a little bit about how your thinking around this has changed since the pandemic? What do you think about more? What do you think is less important?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great question. Thanks, Josh. I mean, when we wrote this, we said that the point of it was to try and show that this was a medium term, that is over 1 or 2 decades, was a potential policy trajectory, and that there were some trade-offs involved. So we said, this is how much it costs, and this is the reduction you get in inequality. And just to let people know, the tax increase, which is quite substantial, it's about $120 billion for this model. But just to put that in perspective, the COVID deficit was 200 billion, and that increase takes Australia to the middle of the OECD league table on taxation rates, right? So it would make us an average tax country, but it would reduce inequality to the levels of Scandinavia. And so we said this is a real trade-off, and that allows a politics to, people can decide which they'd want, but they probably wouldn't do it. $120 billion is too much for one hit. No government would ever spend that much money in 1 year or one electoral cycle, we thought. So this is like a 2 decades plan. And I think the main thing that changed with COVID was by the time it came out and we were doing these interviews, I was saying, well, this is less than the deficit. That's how much it costs. We could do this for less than the deficit. And I think that does, so the kind of fiscal constraint, which is, I think, the main thing that's stopping the world being a more equitable and nice place, that's weakening. Now, is it weakened for the long term? Well, our government has clearly decided that they want to reimpose that fiscal constraint as quickly as they can, even in reasonably nonsensical ways. So the interest bill at Australia, so Australia had actually quite a big stimulus by international standards, about 14-15% of GDP, which is enormous. Like, this is more than the GFC, more than the Great Depression. This is even up there with the deficits at the height of World War II. And so they're not getting back to a surplus anytime soon. But the interest bill on public debt is lower now than it was before COVID, because interest rates fell faster than the deficit rose. So there's actually no reason why we can't be doing this. And that's what, we don't have to go into modern monetary theory. I'm sympathetic to that as well, but you don't have to even go anywhere near that argument. I mean, in some ways, modern monetary theory is almost redundant in a sense, given you can borrow money at 0.2%, right? Like, does it really matter if it's free or it's 0.2%? So I think there's the capacity to do much bigger, bolder things. And I think you're seeing that in the US. And because the US is so central to the global economy and setting global political norms, I think we should be watching really closely how this $1.9 trillion package goes, what the Democrats do in the lead up to the midterms to make longer term changes. And we should be following that lead in terms of the scale, and certainly upping our short-term asks is the thing that really got me. And the other one, and I'll be quick, sorry, I'm talking a bit, is that in the discussion around the big tax cuts, the third wave that are going to come out after the next election, one of the things that we really hit on was this idea that we should be saying, look, if you are going to return bracket creep in some way, if that's the logic of it, then let's reduce the means test. Let's not cut tax rates. Let's reduce the means test for those on low and middle incomes. And that's much better for the economy. It's certainly much better for equality. And it's better for the very incentives that the Australian claims that it cares so deeply about.
Absolutely. Look, let's go to Charles Brass, and then we're going to go to Stephen. And I can't put my hand up as host of the Zoom call, so I'm just marking my spot because I've got a question after Stephen. Charles, please go ahead. Oh, did we just? Yeah, we know. Here you are, Charles.
I just took my hand down.
Yeah.
Yes, everybody on this call has been advocating or has been thinking about the objectives of this for a long time. And we all know that people have been thinking about this for longer than any of us have been alive. So the question that I'm always fascinated by is, why has it not happened? And there's a variety of arguments for why it hasn't happened, but the one that I want to pick up on is that the advocates can't agree among themselves. And we end up fighting amongst ourselves about what the right way to go is. It's a little bit like the climate change argument, in a sense, that there are so many potential solutions out there that when someone advocates a particular solution and someone else advocates another one, there seems to be a competition between them. Now, I don't know that I think this is a bit different, because I think in many cases is a genuine competition between advocates of various things, right down to the language. Those that are absolutely riven to the notion of a universal basic income means that it has to be universal. Ben's talked tonight, and I've certainly talked in the past about other ways of ensuring that if everybody gets the effective benefit without giving people something and then taking it back again. But my question for Ben, and probably for everybody on this, is what is it going to take for us as advocates to get our act into gear so that we can present some sort of concerted face, so that we're not driven apart as a wedge by those who never want to make this happen?
It's a great question. I'm also, that was to everyone, so I'm happy for other people to answer that too.
I feel like Michael and Josh both were jumping out of their skin, wanting to tell, to suggest that he come to more of our monthly action meetings at Basic Income Australia, where we're trying to work on a consensus position and try and speak to all the stakeholders or everyone who's got an idea, such as yourself and Elise Klein and the Greens and whoever else. But Josh or Michael, you put your hand up as well? Did you want to respond to that?
Yeah, I just wanted to say, that Charles is exactly on point of the things that have been concerning us in the basic income group, and looking to draft up an actual policy paper that can then be, there's, I don't know, half a dozen basic income groups in Australia on Facebook and other groups, as Ben has mentioned, academic groups, that starting with a paper that each group can then review, and we try and whittle it down amongst ourselves so that we expand the people who support a document that is concise in its expression of what we collectively want. And in that argy-bargy, there will have to be give and take, but that at some point, if we as individual groups can't agree a specific position, then there's no way that we're going to get the broader community to come on board, because you'll have every different media outlet putting, the dagger in and twisting it on every opportunity to sort of, basically set us fighting against each other. And so, yeah, that was one of the things that we thought we might try and do, but we've only just begun the journey. So, yeah.
Stephen, do we want to go to Josh? Did you want to quickly respond before we get to Stephen's question?
Yeah, I'll just quickly, you mentioned that we have a monthly action group. I've popped a link in the chat for anybody who's here right now, but if anybody is watching this later, you can go to basicincomeaustralia.com and there are event links there.
Okay, Stephen.
Yeah, Ben, what's your opinion of the pursuit of full employment and how, a society based on jobs fits with a universal basic income?
Yeah, it's a very good question. So I'm not opposed to moves towards full employment. Like, I think it's good to have a labour market where workers have more bargaining power, which generally comes about when there are more jobs and less people. I think that job guarantee proposals are a bit more complicated in that the way that we achieve full employment in the 20th century was by imposing a social model of the household as a mechanism to be able to create a little space outside markets. And that was relatively effective at being able to deal with class inequalities, but it did so by creating a highly gendered, raced and heteronormative household, right? Because you kind of need to standardize all of the households so they can have the same amount of labour market access. If that's the mechanism you're going to guarantee people's incomes is via their access to jobs. So one of the problems is people's ability to work or access to work or availability for work is not the same as their need for income. So there is a difficulty in being able to say, well, the way we're going to give you incomes is based on your access to the labour market. and to paid work. So that's my concern with those schemes. I tend to think they're slightly riskier in that it's not that difficult to see a job guarantee scheme turning into work for the dole. I think that we even have elements of that in the current model, where aspects of the same arguments end up in those places. I'm not suggesting that that's what advocates are actually arguing for. Just saying you can see how you lose control of the debate and the politics. It's much, much harder to see how the politics of basic income, other than just losing, fair enough, we might just lose, but it's hard to see how you win in a way that leads to a really bad outcome. I think any version of winning makes things a bit better. And I think that partly goes to the fact that it addresses much more directly a social need. It says people need some income. In a monetary economy, people need some income in order to be able to live. In the same way that people need access to healthcare if they're sick, people need access to childcare if they've got kids. And that is a much easier politics to advance. It's a much easier politics to keep control of. And I also think it's the secret to advancing the real argument behind this, irrespective of the various models, is sticking closely to that politics of need. And that's more, I think, why we also try to come up with some principles of the directions you move in. You try to individualize payments, that you try to increase the base rate, and you try to reduce means testing. And the end model, I think we're much more agnostic about than we are just about those principles. And our model was in many ways just a way of kind of showing the trade-offs in fiscal and inequality terms that happen as you move along that pathway. So if you went all the way, this is what it might look like. But having said that, I don't think we're about to get rid of the labour market or capitalism overnight, to be honest. I do think they might be second or third or fourth round effects potentially. And in the meantime, we definitely need good industrial relations laws, and we definitely need ways of being able to create decent, socially meaningful jobs. But I'd prefer that instead of saying that we're going to guarantee people jobs, we guarantee the kinds of work that need to be done, that we do ecological repair, that we have more care jobs, and we talk about why we need those good jobs, and then we go and create them, rather than saying we need to demand that everyone has a job, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So, just to be provocative, would you be prepared to advocate driving up the unemployment rate, for example? Because I'm sure that's what will come up if somebody says, oh, well, if you give people a universal basic income, they won't work and unemployment will go up. And so then you say, good, that's what we want.
But that's an empirical question, you see, and I'm not convinced that that's true. In fact, I think most of the evidence we have for the sorts of things I'm talking about, the evidence is probably the opposite. So I'm sure at some level of income that probably does happen. But even say the kids version of this, the US one that's just been introduced, which is modelled on what's happened in Canada, showed that when they did do that, radically reduced poverty for families with kids in Canada. This is under Trudeau, so it's very recent. There was no negative labour market supply effect. That is, people didn't work less. They all had more money and they didn't work less. That might happen, and I'm actually fine with it happening. I just don't think it's necessarily the case that it will happen.
I'll just jump in here because this is sort of a good place to segue to my question. Stephen's actually me and Stephen's questions are often aligned a little bit there. So I'm a fan of a guy in the US called Alex Howlett, who runs the Boston Basic Income Chat, which this discussion group is partially inspired by. I see Eddie, another one of his compatriots, is in the chat, I hope he'll jump in later. But one of the things he says is if no one's quitting their job, then the basic income isn't high enough, right? If there's not a single person who says, you know what, screw you, boss, I'm out of here, I don't need this crappy job, right? Then you're actually not getting the benefit of the basic income. And basically that you want to ramp it up to the point where people are leaving bad jobs, not necessarily saying I'll never work again. I just want to quickly address a point of language. when we say the unemployment rate, what we're measuring generally is people who want a job and can't find one, not the labour participation rate. I think what Stephen's actually saying is we want that he would advocate that the labour force participation rate drops, that people say, you know what, I don't want a job, I'm going to go write poetry in a van or whatever it is that they want to do that's not part of the labour market, or, you know, take care of my kids instead of leaving them in childcare, whatever it is, right? One of the things I like to poke holes at the jobs guarantee is, so what we're going to do is we're going to pay people to do childcare and take care of old people, right? And then while they're out taking care of working in a childcare center, we'll send their kids to another childcare center, right? Whereas if they didn't have to leave the house to do the work, they could be taking care of their own kids and their own parents, right? For example. But what I wonder about is we have this position. There's a sort of a framework that seems to be sort of assumed, right? Which is this, that the goal at the end of the day is a fairly, you know, robust, productive, fully employed economy. That this is the goal. And linked into that is, earlier on you said, you know, we wanted to come up with a policy proposal that was possible and that could actually happen. And this is my question is, how do we know what's possible? And I think COVID's shown us that that bigger changes might be possible than we want. So how do you, when you're writing a proposal, how do you determine the bounds of what's politically possible?
It's a fantastic question. Look, our method was to look at things that had happened over the last 50 years or so and go, which elements of those look like moving towards a basic income, even vaguely, and how might you imagine them being ramped up? So that's why we kind of took the family payment model as a bit of a model. And then when we did the actual costings of it, that, as I said, we presumed that wasn't going to be possible in the short run at all. So what's made that possible is completely COVID. And I agree that there are moments in politics where, you know, all of these things are political and they're all choices. And the art of conservative politics is to make people believe they aren't. That's essentially the job, to say, can't afford this, these things aren't possible, this is... And we could do whatever we want, right? They're complicated social questions, but we can do all sorts of radical things if we really want to. But you need to have political movements that will drive them and can exercise that kind of power. And I suppose one of the questions I would have back is, what is that movement? We know from the history of the 19th and 20th century, there were enormous, powerful socialist, social democratic and workers' movements of various ilks that drove quite radical change, up to and including revolutionary change, which both overturned things or threatened to overturn them and increase the bargaining power of those in other countries. And they did reshape things dramatically, but they were still capitalist. People still had jobs. There was still inequality, and that was with that. So I think part of it is, what are the policy instruments that reduce resistance? So what are easier things to accomplish to do the same job? That's a technical question, I might say, that our policy is aimed at. How do you reduce the kind of the technical resistance? And then the other thing is, how do you connect that to a mobilizing politics? And that's why I think it is important to call it a basic income, because I think that mobilizes people in a way that all of the other ways of describing this don't. And why I think it's so important to connect it directly to having enough money to live a decent life, because that's a real tangible thing that you can mobilize around. But I think it still doesn't quite answer the question of what's the organizational form that creates the political pressure that actually brings us about. But maybe you guys have better ideas than I do on that.
I just want to say that's I think that's very insightful. But what I'm always struck by is there's this tension between people trying to come up with a proposal that they think will sort of is not too disruptive, so it can plug into existing sort of frameworks, and at the same time, as you say, you've actually got to inspire people. And you talk about these workers' movements, even if they didn't achieve the overthrow of capitalism, they did have in their sort of rhetorical toolkit this utopian horizon, if you will, of a really fundamentally different world, of a world where you would be, you know, de-alienated and liberated, and where people would be more masters of their own fate and less the subject of other people's And I worry sometimes that progressive politics, especially things like jobs guarantee, it gets very wonky and very clever and very look how sensible and realistic we are, and then they're going to go to the Murdoch press or to the the party leadership and say, look at our sensible proposal, as if they're going to go, oh well, it's so sensible, now we'll do it, right? But they don't have anybody behind, they don't have a mass movement behind them, and part of that perhaps because they're not ambitious enough. So it's very pleasing, gratifying to me to hear that you're sort of feeling through that same tension there. But Michael's got his hand up, so we'll go to him.
So what have you heard from the union movement, Ben, in terms of their attitudes towards a basic income? I mean, I've heard some things, but I'd be interested to know what your thoughts are.
Look, I don't claim to be really well connected to the union movement, but I certainly think there has been a shift from what I would call reasonably outright hostile about 10 years ago to now a range that goes from only moderately hostile through to relatively supportive. Right. And I think the median's probably just on the supportive side now, if you frame it in ways which are not too utopian and don't sound like they're directly in competition with other schemes that they want to achieve. Yeah. But I think that partly reflects some of the campaigning around, $80 a day and the job seeker stuff, which I think has shifted some of the ACTU leadership, even though there's a prickly relationship there. I really think it actually has shifted some of it to going, having people starve when they don't have a job is completely unacceptable. And we do need to do something about that.
But the other side too, though, Ben, isn't it that the basic income is effectively a wage rise at no cost to the employer, effectively. And so...
Yeah, so some people in the union movement think that's a bad thing because they think it's a wage subsidy. It's not a wage subsidy. A wage subsidy is a different thing where you only get it when you have the job through your employer. You don't just get an amount of money regardless of whether you have a job.
No.
And I mean, I think particularly if you say, like, all of the unions are in favour of family tax credit Part A, which is the thing we've modelled this on, and they're all in favour of increasing its base rate and of allowing people to keep more of it. So that's partly also why we try to frame it in ways which allow you to have a conversation with different stakeholders and say, no, it's not that scary. It's just like the thing you know about already in some way, shape or form. But then also allow you to say, hey, this is Australian basic income to, media and to other people and say, and guess what? We did some wonky numbers and it turns out it's entirely possible to do it, which is more or less how that debate played out with the media stuff that we did, and allowed the media to frame it as a realistic policy option in a way that several other costing jobs had been designed to almost do the opposite, to show it costs so much you couldn't possibly do it, right? So that was actually one of the main purposes of us doing this, was to be able to get some numbers where we could say to people, yes, it's expensive, but there's a reasonable trade-off. It's not that different to other choices we've made in the past, and we can do it if we want to do it. Yeah.
Anthony P has asked a question in the comments. Anthony, do you think you can read the question, or do you want me to read it for you?
Okay, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you great.
Okay. I'll read it myself and explain what I mean. Now I've got to think what I said. Okay. I was saying, if there's no national job guarantee along a basic payment alongside of it, what would this mean for people who are disabled or affected by physical, mental health conditions, and who obviously currently, face barriers in the current labour market, and not to mention prejudice, but can and may want part-time employment, because a number of people who are disabled can actually contribute to society. They can work part-time at least. Where would these people be left behind in this proposal? And this is, I suppose, directed to Ben.
Thanks, Anthony. That's a great question too. So I tend to think that, so there are lots of people with disabilities at the moment who have jobs, and a whole range of jobs, but we do have a labour market that is not well designed for those folk. and there are heaps of barriers in it. I suppose my concern, so that's a real problem, and we need to do something about the real problem. So the question is, what's the best strategy to deal with it? My concern about a job guarantee is that almost inevitably those will be minimum wage jobs, and that will infer that the only solution for people with disabilities is to get minimum wage jobs, because it's held out as a solution to that problem, and the only component of that solution is minimum wage jobs. I think there are other ways that we can say there's a real problem there and do something about it, which are about reducing barriers and discrimination in the labour market, and about creating and valuing the kinds of labour and work that people with disability can perform and want to perform, and saying that that kind of work is valuable and it needs to be funded. And I know that sounds a little bit fuzzier, but I tend to think it's a more realistic way of getting a range of good quality jobs, which I agree is a real challenge. And one of the reasons I also think that the test of a basic income shouldn't just be that less people want to have jobs, because I think people want jobs for all sorts of reasons. We want people to leave bad jobs, but we want them to take up good ones.
Yeah, the quality of what sort of jobs there are in the labour market, I think, is really, really important. So, but that's all I wanted to ask.
Not just for disabled people, but perhaps especially. I think the quantity of jobs is often talked about more than the quality of jobs.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That is.
So we go to
so.
Josh. Sorry, Anthony, did you have something else you wanted to add, or should we go to Josh? He's got his hand up.
Actually, yeah, there was one other thing I wanted to say. There was a statement before about people not taking up, jobs, working for pizza places or service stations or what have you, and that somehow they'd rather be on, Job Seeker or something like that. My comment or my thoughts are is that people, how true would that really be? First of all, is that an exaggeration? But the other thing is it gets back to this idea of the quality of what type of work people would be doing, and also the income security as well, because that people even if there was a marginal truth to that statement, let's say that there was, are people actually saying, well, we want to have a stable income, which we can get, when we're on, say, a Centrelink payment, hopefully, compared to, say, a casual or part-time or very insecure job as some of those ones that were mentioned. So that could be a statement that people are making if they're not taking up those jobs, even assuming they had the transferable sort of skills that were needed and the work history and all the rest. So that's just a comment on that.
Ben, did you want to respond to that?
No, you're completely right. I think Josh would probably reaffirm anything that I would anyway.
Josh, let's go.
Okay, I've got a question that maybe isn't even a question, but am I right that historically you're in the same camp as Troy Henderson in that you wanted it to be phased in based on age? I remember, I feel like ages ago you're in the same camp on that.
We wrote a paper on that too, yeah.
Yeah, I thought so. And this one is everybody above 18. I was wondering if you just talk about the age choices that you're making.
Yeah. And that model was kind of this model, but implemented by age. So I think my thinking post-COVID has certainly changed on how this might happen, like what's a phasing mechanism. And at that point, one of the challenges for a basic income is getting a real constituency of real people who are going to campaign for it. So our idea at that point was you could phase it down from the age pension. The age pension is already a little bit like a basic income, certainly in the sense that we have. It's a badly designed one because it has a very high withdrawal rate of 50 cents in the dollar. But, if you ease that out and you reform super and other things, you can do that in an entirely cost neutral way. And then you could lower the age of the age pension. So that was one idea that we had was we've been moving to increase the age of the age pension. Why don't we decrease the age of the age pension and make the pension more compatible with having some work? Yeah, that would at the moment, we make it very incompatible with work and then create a series of workarounds to allow people to earn some money while they have the pension, because they want people to go back to work. In the same way, we exclude the home from the means test, and then we create a series of workarounds to allow people to sell their home and move around so that there's not too strong a disincentive. Anyway, get rid of the means test and you don't have a problem. So we said, why don't we do that? But it's a bit hard. The constituency for lowering ages, I think, is different to raising it. And we thought, look, imagine you gave it to people who are, say, 18 to 21. You've got a bunch of real people who get it. And when they turn 22, they lose it. And you could imagine that it would become a real political issue for those people. Like, in fact, the main thing they'll vote on will be if they get to keep it when they turn 22. And that expanding it from 18 to 21 to 18 to 22 doesn't cost that much money. It's the kind of thing that the government might promise to do. So you could build in, again, a kind of politics that might see its gradual expansion. And that was the logic that we had with that age thing. I think you can probably tell from all of this, we're playing around with ideas of how do you mitigate the resistance to this idea? How do you make that compatible with real groups of people who are going to organise themselves to try and do something about it? And that was one idea we had to play around with that.
I'll just jump in here because okay, Josh, go ahead.
So just to follow up, just to clarify, you've gone for 18 above inclusive on this because COVID has changed your mind, or I'm just trying to feel out the reason for why you're doing it differently.
So we did the thing. We did this before COVID. So I did both things before COVID. But I think the politics of COVID, as I said, I didn't think that this proposal we have now was a short-term realistic one. So it was about saying, well, this is what the endpoint trade-offs are, and it's okay, we can do it. But the politics of COVID have made me think that the way you get there is different, that there's a real politics about increasing the rate, a real politics around reducing the means test. And I think, and we haven't talked about it very much tonight, but there is a different politics around individualisation, which increasingly affects the lives of lots and lots of people in quite dramatic ways, but especially younger people, and is actually pretty horrific in the way that it operates now. And at some point, I think there will be a politics that is mobilised around what it means for single parents to have, you know, the other partner stay over when they're coming in from a different town to be able to see the kids, and that potentially threatens the payment of the first parent because they're suddenly deemed to be back in a relationship, and that changes the means test. And as has happened in Australia and in New Zealand, eventually see someone with a large bill that ends them up in jail because of those kinds of circumstances. So I think there are politics around each of these things that you can imagine moving in that direction. And my thinking of that has changed post-COVID because I think we've seen some of that that really happened with the supplement.
Michael. You're muted, Michael. You're muted.
It's okay.
Sorry.
Yeah, okay. Questions answered. Thanks, Ben.
Okay, so what I was going to say is it sounds like some of the stuff you're doing is it's almost like trying to hack politics, right? You're trying to find a way that we can sort of overcome these institutional blockers. And I appreciate the effort that's going into that, but I kind of feel like we spend a lot of time trying to second guess how things are going to be received, and perhaps not enough time saying what we really want, right? And there's this feeling of sort of stuckness in progressive politics, like nothing's ever going to happen and nothing's ever going to change, and you know that maybe we can tinker at the edges, and even 2011, we've had 2008, the big crash, 2011, this massive moment of global political mobilization. In 2019 and 2020, we actually saw huge amounts of political unrest all over the world, massive mobilizations of young people and progressive politics, and yet we still can't seem to sort of have, as you say, that it doesn't coalesce into any kind of movement that looks likely to seize power. And I mean, the Australian Labor Party has said that the $50 a week increase that's been proposed is too low, but they've refused to even name an alternative number. So what's your best guess at how we overcome this lack of any sense of possibility? How do we make it so that it's possible to actually put forth the ideas we believe in and at least start the negotiation process there?
It's a good question. Look, I think the way that if you look at how radical changes have happened over time, first of all, the time horizons are really long. So we talk about them, when you mention things over a 20-year time horizon, they sound like that's not like you can just mention a series of events. You know, the civil rights movement starts in the 50s and it gets the Civil Rights Act in 1965. Like it's 12 or 13 years of like pretty full-on protest before anything happens much. So there's quite long time horizons. By the time that those things happen, almost always the movements are disappointed. So radical change is happening, but movement expectations have already moved well ahead of the change that eventually happens. I think we saw that with the equal marriage plebiscite, where by the time it happened, I mean, to be honest, you asked people 10 years earlier, imagine that we're going to have equal marriage and everyone would have gone, that's crazy. I mean, in 2004, the Labor Party voted explicitly to remove gay marriage from the law, right? That when they included man and woman in the legislation for the first time, and they voted for it. But by the time we got there, most people in the movement were disappointed by how we got there, and most people thought that that was not an adequate response. And that's a normal movement dynamic, that movements become strong, they build up, they raise expectations, something happens that's never enough, and it takes a lot of time. Who would have guessed 4 years ago that the coalition would win the election and then implement the first real increase in New Start in the last 30 years? Like, I don't reckon anyone had money on that at all. And even before the last election, I think there was almost no money that Labor would do it, let alone that Labor would go, yeah, but we're going to do it by more. So I think we are actually seeing a successful politics of this. It's happening. It's just really slow and clunky, and it's not very satisfying as it happens. And we haven't had our Whitlam moment where we at least, but I mean, I think people also forget most of the left thought Whitlam was a complete sellout. Like, he was really unpopular amongst the left in Australia at the time of the actual government. In retrospect, views change. But at the time of the government, almost all left groups thought that he was a sellout. He was from the right of the Labor Party. He was pro the alliance. He was anti-revolution. So I think that's part of the thinking this through is, well, what are the individual campaigns that we can run, and how do you create a broader language, a more utopian language around all of those things that helps people connect them to a different world, not just to a series of incremental demands. And you guys, I think this group is part of doing that.
Well, that's the idea. I'll push back a little bit. You say the first. Who would have thought they would have done the first real raise in 30 years? And it's like, it's only so amazing because the last 30 years have been so lackluster, right? It's this. We're getting, the sort of some signs that there's flickers of life, that the total brain death of Australian politics has it may be, some thawing around the edges of this big block of ice. So there's definitely signs of hope, but it would be nice. I just say it would be nice to be talking about what we think is, what is actually necessary in terms of justice, or in take climate change to what's actually necessary in terms of the science, rather than what is politically achievable, right? And sort of starting with that. But Stephen's got his hand up, so Stephen, go ahead.
Yeah, do you think the women's movement will take up a basic income? Because I see them as the biggest possibility for social change. Like the next election, it's going to flare up like huge, the role of women in Australia. So do you think there's a possibility there?
I do. And I think one of the real questions for all of us, like we're almost all blokes on this call, that is typical of basic income discussions I've been in. Not completely, but it's relatively male dominated. And yet, on our numbers, certainly the main beneficiaries are women, right? At least just in dollar terms. So I think there is a question there about, what's not connecting that we could connect better? I certainly think that individualization of payments stuff is completely a gender issue, and is one that I think the women's movement in parts has already taken up and is likely to take up more. Thanks, Rosemary. And maybe Rosemary can answer the question instead of me after this. So, so I think that is a really big bit, and I think the other bit is the making any basic payment fit in with having some amount of work and not the same amount of work every week in an easy way is actually a real bread and butter issue. And I think one of the only reasons we haven't seen it as a gendered issue until fairly recently is because the parenting payment was designed more like the proposal we're talking about. It had a higher amount of money you could earn. You lost less money in the dollar as you went back into work. It was designed to combine being on some payment and receiving some labour market income, and for that to change over time. And that was fought for very hard by the women's movement, and was, a very clever kind of navigating its way through the policy architecture at the height of neoliberalism. I think that started to change again because so many single parents have been chucked back into JobSeeker and Newstart by the reforms of the Howard government, and then the ungrandfathering by Gillard. And that certainly, I think, has led to one of the surges of around the $80 a day stuff and the unemployed workers union, and even some of the reinvigoration of ACOS and GetUp getting involved in that. So I think you're completely right. And part of our job, I think, is to think through, well, where are the signs of that happening, and how do we make what we're talking about look more like that and speak to it more effectively?
Rosemary, we saw your thumbs up on those comments. Are you sure you don't want to add some comments to this topic? She's staying muted. She's too smart to
I'm happy listening. Thank you.
Okay.
Sorry to put you on the spot.
No,
That's all right.
We have tried in this group to to make sure that we always include the voices of women. We've had a lot of our guests have been female advocates of the basic income. Our first guest was, oh my God, Abigail Boyd from the Greens, who I think is a really powerful advocate. Have you had much contact with her and with the Greens and their policy team on this at all?
Yeah, so I mean, look, to be honest, part of the discussion, so Elise is in the Greens, I'm in the Greens, Troy used to be in the Greens, and a fair bit of this came out of negotiating this process through the Greens policy process, which taught us a few things about where even the utopian party is at in terms of convincing them of stuff. The Greens have actually shifted quite a long way since over time. I was a co-convener of the Greens back in 2013, I think 2013. It's a while ago. So part of it came from, Troy was like always a bit of a true believer. When I started talking to Troy, I wasn't, and I got persuaded by the process, to be honest. And then got re-engaged fully by Tim Hollow, who's runs the Greens Institute. And Elise was doing similar policy work in Victoria. So we hooked up. I actually hooked up with Elise for the first time through the Greens rather than academia. And then we started talking about this stuff. So in a sense, yeah, absolutely. And I know Abigail well. And yes, I'm still talking to her about a range of things, including about basic income. Yeah. So
what would you say? I mean, well, we're on there's two things. I'll say Michael's got his hand up. Sorry, Michael, I'll come to you in a second. I just saw that. But what could you just tease out? Are there any major differences between your proposal and the Abigail Boyd's universal wellbeing payment, I believe is the name she gave it, and her proposal. Is there what are the differences and why why do you think there is any divergence there?
Look, I can't remember all the details off the top of my head. I think the only main difference was that her payment isn't means tested at all. And that's also partly because it's a state. It's partly pitched at a state level. It doesn't have income tax, right? It's not in charge of the income tax system. Yeah, I think that her proposal is a great proposal. Completely support it. I mean, I suppose I'm a bit agnostic about the various different models. Partly for the reasons I think it was Chris that was here before was talking about. Which are you don't want to get too hung up on, perfection being the enemy of the good or whatever. So I tend to think these are all ways of starting a conversation and engaging people in a conversation. And, she's pitching a slightly different conversation to the one we were pitching, but I think they're entirely complementary.
It was Charles, I think you were speaking about before. I did want to follow up on one of the things he said. I think he's actually dropped off the call. I'm not sure if he's still here, but maybe he says, well, we've got all these different points of view, and actually we all need to sort of coalesce around one proposal, and that's how we achieve political viability. I'm not sure that's true, because I think at the end of the day there'll be a government in power and they'll craft their own policy to do it. They're not going to come to us and copy our homework. So perhaps the best thing is actually to have a variety of proposals, and they can they've got a menu of different kinds of different flavors of basic income that they can sort of pick and choose from to get one that they can get consensus on in the party room and so on.
I agree. I tend to, there's something in policy literature that says that often the best way to get something done is to define the problem, not the solution. And I think one of the things we need to think about is what's the problem that's trying to be solved here. And that is a really interesting one, because I don't think the basic income movement advocates all agree. But it is often much more powerful to influence governments to give them a problem they have to solve.
Michael, did you want to jump in? You're muted again.
Yeah, I just had a question for understanding, Ben. You mentioned about individual payments being a feature. Can you just clarify for me what you mean by that?
Yeah, so in Australia's system at the moment, we have partner tests on most. So we have two types of means tests for most payments. There's a test on your income, and then there's a test on your partner's income, or if you're a young person, a test on your parents' income.
Right.
And so you're not treated as an independent economic unit.
Right.
That I actually think is a really big thing for a whole range of different people in different ways that we don't talk about very much. But a lot of people, I think, during COVID just worked out, and one of the reasons they increased the partner test is there are lots of folk in the big capital cities who are paying off mortgages or with big rents where they need both people's income. And they worked out that during COVID, if one of the people loses the income and the other one doesn't, the person who lost their income gets absolutely nothing at all. Like there's no form of insurance for them. They just free fall, right?
Yeah.
And in many of those relationships, people are not used to going that they don't have any of their own money. So it creates enormous strains within relationships for someone to suddenly just have no money of their own at all. So I actually think there's quite a lot that can be done with it.
No, understood now. So I mean, you're basically saying everybody should be treated as their own economic unit. Okay, I agree. Thanks.
And if they want to then pool that income in a household, that's up to them, but we're not keeping track of where everyone's spending their nights and so on and so forth. And if someone wants to leave the relationship, they don't have to leave first, then go and say, now I'm single and I don't have an income. Can you please help me out, Centrelink, and wait 6 weeks and end up homeless and go back and get abused or whatever it is. Earlier on, you said you can't imagine running into problems with the basic income. Now, there's two things that often get flagged up as problems. Actually, I can think of three that we might we'll go through them. One is one thing that's brought up that people will often say, especially on the left, who are opponents of a basic income, is that it's some kind of trick, and that all the basic income advocates want to do is give you this so that they can take away free education, and they can take away everything else, and they can attack unions and cut wages and do all these other nefarious things. Now, I've found examples of people in America who believe this, that the basic income is a way of marketizing the welfare state and getting rid of the public sector in a lot of cases. Put everything in the market, and if you're going to do anything, you just give people money. But have you ever met one of those people in Australia? Because I've never even met one, never actually had a Zoom conversation with anybody in real life. Like, there's this sort of theoretical basic income advocate out there, and all the basic income advocates I meet are in favor of expanding public services.
They do. There was a paper that was written, I can't remember the guy's name, but the Centre for Independent Studies put out a paper in the 2000s that advocated for a basic income along those lines. And it was also a very low payment. Like, even then it was below New Start and liquidating a whole bunch of things. So I don't deny that that is the case, but I just think the politics of that don't work that way. So I don't think in the real world, any real live political party could say, we're going to give you an extra $10,000 a year and we're getting rid of Medicare, and people kind of not notice that Medicare's gone, right? It just doesn't work like that. And like, there's been lots of attempts to get rid of Medicare. It's very hard. And so I just don't think that, Wallace, I think the logic that says everyone deserves a job, but that also means that if you offer them one, they have to take it. And if they don't, you should punish them. I actually think that actually comes pretty naturally and is a really dangerous politics and hard to control. So it's because it's hard to take away entitlements that it becomes really difficult to just compensate people in that simplistic a way. And there's certainly no one in the current Liberal Party who's in any way powerful who would do it. There's no one on the left who advocates it. So I agree, it's not a real thing. There's no real prospect of that happening.
The other one that gets brought up is, well, rents and house prices will just increase. And that this is that all of our gains will disappear and we'll be back to zero. What's your response to that line of attack on a basic income?
So first of all, I think that's a useful line of attack if what you're saying is the only policy we need is a basic income and you don't need to do anything else at all. And if that's your position, then I think there are some problems with it, because housing is a real issue, quite separate from basic income, and is hard to reconcile with it. But other than that, there is some quite good evidence now recently published over the summer from Ahuri that looked at the impact of rent assistance increases. And that is a useful kind of corollary to this. And they found that rent assistance in areas where almost everyone's on rent assistance, so that's similar to if everyone got a new basic income when they were all on low incomes, right? Did increase rents, but it increased rents by about 10% of the increase in rent assistance. So I think it will absolutely, if you generally speaking, if you give a group of people more money, the things that group of people spend their money on will go up in price. That will happen. So the things that low-income people spend their money on, particularly low-income housing, will go up in price if there isn't other policies to address housing. But it won't go up by anywhere near as much as their increase in income will go up. So they'll still be better off.
So the increase won't absorb the total. The increase in house prices won't absorb the whole amount, is what you're.
No, not even a majority of it.
Before Josh, I want to add a little bit more there. So
I might need to give a 5-minute warning too, just to let you know that I promised my partner I'd go downstairs at some point.
Okay, well, we've got 10 minutes left. Is that works?
10 minutes? Yeah. Sorry, I thought it was 7:30, but I misrepresented it to her.
No, sorry, I've booked it for an hour and a half. I'm sorry, I may not have made that entirely clear if you've been expecting to get. Anyhow,
all good. That's fine.
We'll be wrapping up in 10 minutes. Josh will get to you. I would suggest that there's another thing. One of the things that's happening is at the moment you see this sort of struggle between the central bank, the Reserve Bank, and the government. And there's a sort of where the government's like, everything's fine, the recovery's underway, we don't need any more money, and the Reserve Bank doesn't seem to agree, and it's pushing interest rates down really low as a way of stimulating the economy. And so, sure, a basic income or any kind of government spending or wage increase, any kind of redistribution of income is going to push up house prices to some extent, but nothing pushes up house prices like really cheap interest rates can, right? So we've got these, massive, this staggering increase in house prices during an economic downturn at the moment because of the central bank response. And my feeling is that if you actually had a basic income, then you would see some inflationary pressure, and the Reserve Bank would respond by with some tightening of monetary policy, which would deflate or at least stop the rapid inflation of asset bubbles in general, such as including housing. What do you think of that basic premise?
Yes, certainly the deep stagnation we're in is creating this kind of asset version of capitalism where profits are realized through capital gains, not through increases in revenue streams. That's completely true. I think there is a version of that, though, that collateralizes all new streams of income. And so there's certainly some evidence from universal type payments for the poor in South Africa and Brazil that what most of those payments end up going towards is debt repayments. And that, which is not actually necessarily a bad thing. It means that people are on top of their payments and they can get the little bit of capital they need to be able to start up a small business and all sorts of things. But I imagine, like we see, it's first home buyers that are actually pushing up house prices currently. It's not investors. And if you increased the incomes of people and you don't change anything else in the system, I think capital would find a way to make claims over those income streams by pushing up housing costs and other utility costs from private monopolies, essentially.
So we still need other action. We still need other action from the government in these markets. We still need public housing, public utilities, stuff like that. Yeah.
Completely.
Josh, we'll get your question in, and then we'll be coming towards the end.
Yeah, you mentioned that there was a recent paper on just over the summer about people's rents not rising as much as their incomes. Can you give me something just so I can search it and find it? A name?
I can actually, if you email me, I can give you the reference because I've cited it in a paper.
Okay.
I can't remember. It's got like 10 people involved in it. Chris Martin was one of them from City Futures, and I think he did tweet about it when it happened.
Okay.
Okay, last question, unless someone puts their hand up very quickly. The third sort of stumbling block in opposition to basic income that I've heard is the one of environmental overshoot, that if we increase people's incomes, we increase consumption, and it's bad for the environment.
Yeah, and I think that's, again, just you have to do some other stuff too, right? So there is a tension between the fact that lots of people don't have enough resources to live decent lives, and that the way our system's currently set up, increasing the resources that people have to live their lives has ecological consequences. And that requires radical redistribution. The reason that COVID decreased ecological impacts, which it did, at the same time that overall production declined, but poverty rates declined too. So real consumption radically equalised. The consumption of the poorest households in Australia, other than those who were non-Australian citizens who were completely excluded, but of Australian citizen and permanent resident households, the lowest income ones all increased their actual consumption. They bought more food, they paid for their medicine, but in fact, they often upgraded their housing. So, but total consumption fell. So what happened? What happened was no one went to Aspen. Yeah. Most business trips were cancelled.
People did Zoom conferences instead of flying to a
So we massively,
yeah.
What actually happened was, because we wanted to shut down production as much as possible, we made political choices about prioritising those forms of consumption that directly help people live decent lives, and we shut down conspicuous consumption. Like, that's what actually happened. Completely possible, It's entirely and consistent with the basic income. But it means that you have to do the other bit too. You have to shut down conspicuous consumption, not just raise up living standards at the bottom, but entirely possible to do it.
And do you think that explains some of the massive right-wing pushback against
the
coronavirus response? Because they said, it smacks of socialism, all this leveling out of people's access to resources.
Completely.
Yeah, okay. I think if anyone's got any more comments, I think that's a perfectly good spot for us to wrap up. Nothing wrong with finishing 5 minutes early. And thank you, Ben, for joining us. Thanks, everybody else.
Thanks so much for having me too.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, we'll stay on a
Really
little in the post
Thank
if
you.
anyone wants
Thank
to
you.
talk.
Thank you.
See ya.
All right. Thank you very much.
I look forward to seeing your paper, Ben. Thank you very much.
No worries. And look, feedback is really welcome. So if you see anything you like or that you don't like, let us know, and we'd really like to hear about it.
Well, I'd like to send you a paper that we're working on as well as part of the group to get your feedback too, Ben. That'd be really, really.
Very happy to do that. Sounds like a great effort.